Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and a really warm welcome on a cold day to our IPM in Amenity webinar. And this is the second webinar in our series from BASIS over this winter, which is all focusing on IPM. So we're looking at IPM in agriculture, IPM in horticulture, IPM around the world, and we're here today to talk about IPM in the amenity sector. I'm delighted to be here today with our two speakers, and I'll introduce them in a moment. So just as we start, we're on a webinar, so sadly we can't see you or hear you, but you can very much communicate with us. So you should be able to see on the side of your panel, there's 3 dots, and there's an opportunity to chat to us and to ask us questions as we go through today. So you should be able to bring up an image that looks like this in the chat. If you could possibly, for those of you that have a BASIS registered through the professional register or the amenity training register, this counts towards your CPD points. So if you could add your 200 number, we'll allocate the points for you to attend. If you've got questions, and we encourage questions and conversation as we go through today, if you could pop them in the question and answer section, then we'll make sure they're asked to our speakers as we go through this session. So feel free to add into the chat or to the Q&A as we go through. We're due to be here until 1 o'clock today. And I'll explain how that's going to work in a minute, and we'll be finished before that. But this session is being recorded so that we can then share that through the BASIS classroom for those that might not be able to make the session live today. So we're here to talk all about IPM and amenity today, and I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers. Richard Stow, who's Managing Director of Weedfree, a weed control company that works across the country and is one of our valued Amenity Assured members. And Rich has got a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion today about how we can look at implementing IPM, integrated weed management, in the amenity sector, the opportunities and potentially the challenges. Richard, I think you're going to share some of your kind of concepts and ideas of how we can do. And then secondly, I'm delighted to welcome Sean Faulkner, and Sean's Sales Director for Kersten UK, and has developed lots of kind of ideas and research and initiatives about how we can manage weeds specifically on hard and artificial surfaces. And Sean, I know, is passionate. From the very first time I met Sean, he's always told me about the opportunities for managing weeds in the amenity sector and the different ways that we can look at it. So we've got Richard presenting first. Sean's going to take us through his prevention first approach, and then we'll have questions and discussion as we go through. We've got some resources at the end, and then, like I say, we'll be finished for 1 o'clock for you to have your lunch. So just before we kind of launch into the discussions and into the presentations, we thought we'd have a bit of audience involvement. So if you can see on your panel on the right-hand side, there's an icon called polls. If you can click on that icon, then we've launched a poll for you to take part in. And we'd like to know, well, we're doing a session on integrated pest management, integrated weed management, and which of these is the correct order, would you say, for IPM? If we're thinking about IPM, what would come first? Would it be control first, prevention, monitoring, and then you evaluate? Would you maybe monitor first and then go and do your control, think about how that's worked, and then think about prevention? Or would it be prevention, monitoring, control, and evaluation? What do you think the principles of IPM are? So we've got lots of votes going on and happening. It's great. We've got lots of suggestions coming in, and it's between monitoring, control, evaluation, and prevention, or prevention, monitoring, control, and evaluation. And they're going up and down. You're deciding between you. So I think most people are there, probably voted now. So Jade, if you're able to close that poll. We've got 78% people thinking it's starting with prevention and 20% going for monitoring and control. So the 78% of you that went for prevention, you're right in thinking in that aspect. And I think we'll develop and think about that a bit more as we go forward. And IPM really is is in that way. It works in the round, but prevention really is the start of where we think in terms of IPM. What have we got? What pest, weed, or disease have we got in terms of the identification, and then how can we prevent that occurring? What measures can we do to stop that happening in the first place? How can we then monitor for what we've got? And then we look at the control options, and the control options can be cultural controls, physical controls, biological controls, and chemical controls. And then thinking about that, we can then evaluate our approach before we start again. And certainly in the amenity sector, you have the opportunity to evaluate that through the season as much as year on year. And so our speakers today are going to delve into this in much more detail and think about what stages we can do to think about the prevention, monitoring, control, and evaluation. And so just before we started, to make sure everybody's got an opportunity to have used the poll, as you all know where it is now, we've got another poll just to kind of do. So if you think about kind of the different things that you do on site when you're working in the amenity sector, which of the following areas do you think you're doing already? Do you use kind of techniques from prevention, from kind of monitoring? Do you use cultural controls in your activities? Do you use physical controls, biological ones perhaps, the chemical controls, and are you evaluating? So if you're happy to go back onto the poll and select those kind of different areas, you can select as many as you do. You're probably doing it, all of them maybe, definitely some of them. So select as many as you see are relevant, and then we can just see which ones you're using as we're there. And I think that will help Sean and Richard to kind of frame what they do as well. It's interesting for all of us to see what you're doing already, and then hopefully by the end of this webinar, I'll have given you some ideas of what you can do. So we've got lots of people doing prevention, Sean, which is great. Monitoring's out there, Richard, and you do that a lot as a kind of a business as to what's out there, and before you have your contracts and what you do. We've got some cultural controls, less so on physical, and I think Sean, you've got some ideas potentially on what we can do in that area as we go through. Biological controls, and Richard, I think you kind of pick up on some of the alternatives maybe to the chemical solution. Yeah, we've got, the chemical solution is there, and then a good percentage of people evaluating their approach before next year. And that's a big part of IPM, is thinking about it. Great. So thank you. Hopefully you're all there. You found the polls, you found the chat, and then we're away. So now, Jade, if we could possibly load Richard's presentation, and I'd like to hand over to Richard to start us off for today. Great. Thank you, Richard. Over to you to talk us about IPM in the amenity sector. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Stow. I'm the Managing Director of Weedfree Limited. I'm a member of the BASIS Professional Register, and I've been working at Weedfree Limited for the past 25 years. By way of a quick introduction to Weedfree, as the name suggests, we are primarily a weed control contractor, and amongst other things, deliver industrial, amenity, and railway weed control services throughout the UK. Much of the work that we do is the application of glyphosate to hard surfaces, be that pavements or railway ballast. We apply residual herbicides to industrial and railway sites, but the majority of the work that we do is the application of glyphosate to hard surfaces. I'm here today to talk to you about implementing integrated weed management in the amenity sector. As I've already mentioned, our area of expertise is hard surfaces, including pavements, roads, gullies, railway ballast. I'll leave parks, golf courses, soft amenity areas, and other soft surfaces to those who have had a lot more experience than I in these areas. So let's talk about integrated pest management on amenity hard surfaces. As a contractor, we generally deliver the services that are specified by our clients. In my experience, we are very rarely approached by a client and asked how to manage weeds on a hard surface using an integrated approach. What we are very often asked is how to control weeds on hard surfaces without using glyphosate, not herbicides in general, but one herbicide, that being glyphosate. If there was an approved pesticide similar to glyphosate, regardless of its safety profile, as long as it wasn't actually glyphosate, I'm confident that our clients would jump at the chance of using it, despite it being a pesticide. Just to clarify, there are approximately 100 approved products for hard surface weed control, most of which contain glyphosate. There are only 2 products approved for hard surface weed control that do not contain glyphosate, and these contain acetic acid or vinegar. Typically, acetic acid is applied at 100 litres per hectare. Glyphosate is applied at 5 litres per hectare. So I don't think we should confuse integrated pest management with the abolition of glyphosate. We're not talking the same thing. When clients approach Weedfree, and many have, and ask for a non-glyphosate alternative to their current weed control program, it's not because they are wanting to follow the government's National Action Plan, or they have been reading up on the Plant Protection Product Sustainable Use Regulations and now want to ensure that they are using pesticides sustainably and are considering integrated approaches and techniques. No, it's because they're under pressure to stop using glyphosate, short and simple. It's public and media pressure to stop using a specific herbicide, by which any stretch of the imagination is not integrated pest management. It's not integration, it's simply using one method to control weeds in place of another. Integrated pest management has got nothing to do with the abolition of glyphosate. Across the world, the definition of integrated pest management is fairly universal. Coordinated and planned strategy for the prevention, detection, and control of pests. Use a combination of methods that work together to manage a given pest. Managing pests economically with the least possible risk to people, property, and the environment. It's not about finding a single alternative to a brand of herbicide that is currently having a little bit of a public relations crisis at the moment. But what can you do? The client is always right. And if Mr. Local Authority wants rid of glyphosate and wants to know how much the alternatives are going to cost, then that's what we do. That's our job. And we've done it over and over again. And on a few occasions, not many, but a few, the client has agreed. And instead of paying around £10,000 per application to control the weeds on the streets of a typical London borough with glyphosate, they choose to pay upwards of £90,000 per application to have their weeds controlled using hot water. Normally, we would apply 3 applications of glyphosate to a typical London borough. So let's say £30,000 per year to achieve a weed-free level of control. You might find the odd weed here and there, but that's the nature of hard surface weed control, where residual herbicides are limited to just one CDA product. However, for many years, the cost-effective application of glyphosate to the UK streets and pavements has been the preferred option, and for good reason. It's safe, effective, has a low carbon footprint, uses very few resources, water, fuel, etc., and it's cheap. On the other hand, using the slides have gone forward a little bit too much. On the other hand, using hot water for this example, at £90,000 per application, a whopping £270,000 for 3 applications, running back to back throughout the year. Overall control was very poor. Hot water does not kill plants, it wilts plants, then they grow back again. And applying pressurized boiling water has its own health and safety concerns. And boiling water using diesel all day, every day, throughout the growing season, well, you can only imagine the carbon footprint and the resources required. And have you seen what boiling water does to bees? Incidentally, it doesn't really matter what direct alternative you choose to replace glyphosate. If you simply swap glyphosate for an alternative, you're looking at a cost increase of around 10 times. And that's without delving into the carbon footprint, resources, and additional labor. Most alternatives are very slow and require huge amounts of labor to achieve lesser levels of control than you would with a herbicide. And many alternatives use heat or machines, which in turn use large quantities of fuel to operate properly. Weedfree has had direct experience of most alternatives being trialled or adopted instead of glyphosate. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at the end. But the point I'm making is that this is not integrated pest management. It's not even alluding to be integrated pest management. So let's move on and talk about integrated pest management on a hard surface, how it can be achieved. Actual integrated pest management is not high up on everybody's agenda, at least not in our sector. Admittedly, integrated pest management fits better into horticulture, sports turf, and biodiverse environments where biological controls are more easily integrated. And integrated pest management on hard surfaces is not straightforward. In my opinion, there are two reasons why integrated pest management has not gained the momentum on our streets and pavements as it has in agriculture, sports turf, and horticulture. Reason one, as I've already mentioned, is that integrated pest management has been hijacked by the anti-glyphosate lobby. Instead of integrating alternative methods with reduced applications of herbicide, herbicide is removed from the equation entirely, creating a very expensive and almost impossible position to achieve on a large-scale urban hard surface environment. And reason two is cost. Integrated pest management, at least initially, costs more than a simple, cost-effective application of herbicide. And in this day and age, who is going to specify a more costly option? But with so many thinking that integrated pest management means the removal of herbicide altogether, it's no wonder that the options on the table are so expensive. It's a case of one extreme to the other. Cheap and effective herbicide versus labor-intensive, costly alternatives that simply do not achieve the same level of control that we have all grown accustomed to. This head-to-head, this is one or the other, is not integration. But where a client understands what integration does mean, the conversation can then move on. The costs become acceptable. The carbon neutral objective is now achievable, and dare I say it, everybody is happy. Maybe not everybody. In fairness, affordable integrated pest management on hard surfaces is not exactly straightforward. However, Weedfree has been involved with some success stories. We have had some good and even ongoing positive outcomes, and bearing in mind that integrated pest management isn't exactly a high priority during these times of inflation, recession, and cost of living crisis, a few good news stories can go a long way. When a two-way relationship between a client and a contractor is developed, change can be achieved. An example is a long-term client of ours was under a lot of pressure to ban the use of herbicides, but instead of the normal knee-jerk reaction of replacing herbicides with an expensive, time-consuming, less effective, carbon-heavy alternative, they choose to reduce the amount of herbicide they applied, and not once, but year after year. A long-term phased reduction. In general, the chemical-free lobby is a minority. However, they are a very vocal minority. Our client listened to their concerns and responded with a compromise. They responded with a public commitment to reduce the use of herbicides year after year. This was initially achieved with the use of adjuvants, water conditioners, and the reduction in the application rate. Further still, reductions were achieved by reducing the frequency of treatment within specified areas. There were no spray areas and coordination between sweepers, street cleansers, and hand spray teams resulted in a truly integrated approach. The overall cost increased, but only a little. On hard surface environments, there are few obvious variables, but there is so much more that can be done. The example I've just given resulted in a significant reduction in herbicide usage simply by coordinating street cleansing teams, road sweepers, and hand spray teams. All that was needed was the knowledge and the motivation to achieve the objective. Now, if your objective is to maintain a weed-free environment where every weed is reported as a defect and weeds of any type and size are simply not tolerated, then you've got your work cut out, and you're probably going to end up using a whole lot of resources and possibly a whole lot of weed killer. And for many years now, 95% weed control has been written into street tenders. It's the status quo, but is 95% weed-free applicable everywhere? Do residents want scorched earth, or will they tolerate a few weeds here and there? I don't know about you, but some of the prettiest and most impressive villages, towns, and cities I've visited have weeds growing on their streets. Not huge amounts of weed. Most are controlled by the constant footfall and regular street cleansing that goes on every day, day after day. But weeds are there, maybe adding to the aesthetic, some might say. A ruin wouldn't be a ruin without a few weeds or tree roots twisting around what was once a magnificent ancient structure. And maybe this is at the core of the problem. We see weeds as a sign of our failure with our constant battle with nature. But are a few weeds really going to lead to our downfall? Does it matter if the odd weed is growing on the back edge of our pavements? So, how about we start by considering where and how much weed we are prepared to tolerate as a starting point? Maybe none in our smart city centres or busy industrial areas, but what about our suburban areas? What about our villages, rural areas, and all the areas in between? Would it matter if the weeds grew a little more on the streets and pavements where our children play? If an integrated approach is ever going to become universal in our hard surface urban environments, we are going to have to ensure that we are trying to achieve a goal that is acceptable and achievable. Another example I'd like to tell you about is a client of ours that is committed to reducing both pesticides and carbon. Engaging with Weedfree from the start, they considered the number of alternative approaches as well as conventional herbicide treatments. This, in my mind, is a truly integrated approach. They started with a consultation with residents to provide a real indication of public opinion. From the consultation, they were able to classify areas and streets which each required a different approach, where in the past all areas were simply treated multiple times with herbicide. Sensitive areas such as schools and hospitals would be treated using hot water, but these were limited areas which could be treated quickly using smaller equipment. Areas which were regularly swept were omitted from the routine weed spraying altogether, as the process of constant sweeping kept the weeds at bay. But where weeds were identified as a problem in these areas, they were either hand pulled or spot treated. By far, the most important factor, which is essential to any successful integrated approach, is the desire to monitor, review, and respond as required. Where an approach is not achieving the goal, changes should be made to that approach in those areas. You have to be flexible and make changes as and when they're required. An integrated approach is a balance that ultimately requires less and less pesticide to achieve the desired outcome. And here lies the issue. Integrated pest management is not a contract you can award to the lowest bidder and walk away from. It requires everybody to get involved and integrate with each other. From local government, cleansing contractors, bin collectors, road sweepers, and even those who design and build our urban environments, all have to work together with a common goal. And instead of lining up the most qualified and experienced contractors and asking them to race to the bottom with their lowest price to apply herbicide 3 times a year, why not incentivize contractors to reduce the quantities of herbicide applied and seek suggestions of how this might be achieved while maintaining an acceptable level of control? This is a massive subject with a vast range of solutions, starting with very small changes to the way we think about weeds and how vegetation is currently managed through to huge transformations of our urban environment. But if some authorities can find hundreds of thousands of pounds, and I mean hundreds of thousands of pounds, to control their weeds without any pesticides, I'm sure most authorities can find it within their budget to manage their vegetation using less pesticide and at the same time employing alternative techniques. So, to sum up, the previous slide has the sums up. Thank you. The abolition of glyphosate is not equal to integrated pest management. Where the abolition of glyphosate is an objective, you must be prepared for significant increases in cost, increased use of hydrocarbons, and the reduced levels of control. Integrated pest management is the amalgamation of different methods to achieve a desired goal, and in most cases, herbicide will be one of those methods. Where a zero tolerance to weeds is desired, a cost versus chemical compromise is always going to be an issue. And finally, integrated pest management on hard surfaces does not have to cost the earth, but it will require a concerted effort from all stakeholders, not just your weed control contractor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a fascinating talk through the journey of the amenity sector and views and opinions on integrated pest management. I can see we've got some questions coming in already, and I've certainly got a few I'd like to ask you and similarities. So that was really interesting. Thank you for your perspective and talking us through, like we said at the beginning, those opportunities and the challenges and what we need to be thinking of. So thank you very much. So we'll bring Richard back for the questions and answers in a minute, but I'd now like to hand over to Sean, and Sean's going to talk us through how we can maybe think about the design of our surfaces in terms of managing our weeds. So over to you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Teresa said, I'm Sean from Kersten. Kersten import and manufacture equipment for maintaining outdoor surfaces. But I won't be talking to you particularly about the machinery today. One of our largest areas of interest is weed management. And what I'll be talking about is implementing a weed prevention strategy to maintain your hard and artificial surfaces. And most of the stuff I'll be talking about is extremely simple, going back to probably GCSE biology for some people. But it's extremely effective nature-based solutions that we're talking about. First, I think it's quite important that we make a distinction between weed prevention and weed killing, and establish exactly what I mean when I talk about weed prevention. So most of us are probably familiar with an analogy I like to use, which is a headache you might get after drinking too much on the previous night. And we can often reach for the painkillers to alleviate the headache, which is one of the symptoms. And just the same as that, we could reach for the bottle of glyphosate to spray the weeds as they've occurred. But we could also have avoided the pain of the headache in the first place had we avoided drinking so much alcohol, or had we drunk some more water during the evening. Now, water is a good solution for killing weeds, and it's also a good solution for treating a headache to an extent, but its use as a remedial solution to both problems is not the same as its use as a preventative solution to those problems, and we have to treat them a bit differently. So taking water throughout the evening with your alcohol will have a much bigger effect than it will trying to treat the headache after it's occurred. Whereas taking the painkiller while you're having the alcohol during the evening won't have very much effect, but it will have a greater effect after the headache's occurred. And it's a similar thing with weed killer. So when we're looking at treating hard surfaces and preventing problems on hard surfaces, one of the first things we need to really understand is what the objective of the hard surface is. So there's lots of different types of surface, from gravel to concrete and tarmac, block paving or an artificial sports pitch, and they're all doing slightly different jobs. And it's important to understand these differences to try and come up with an effective solution. So most of them will be supporting the weight of traffic using the surface, which can be compromised as the surface gets damaged. Most of them will be providing grip for surface users, which again can be compromised as detritus or a layer of soil or moss builds up on the surface. They need to remove surface water quickly to prevent flooding. they need to provide a safe and accessible environment for users. So, for example, a footpath, when it's nice and open, allows two people perhaps in pushchairs or wheelchairs to pass. And then as weeds encroach further and further onto the surface, it makes that job impossible. And then finally, a lot of surfaces are there to look good. And weeds are obviously a problem for that. So if weeds aren't the core problem, they're a symptom, what are the real problems? Well, detritus buildup is a massive one that I'm going to be talking about today. And that's the buildup of organic material on the surface, which degrades into soil. So this organic material might come from trees or grass, and lots of other animals might bring it onto the surface. And then to a lesser extent from what I'm going to be talking about today, but it's still important, surface compaction. So surface compaction can just be caused by pressure compressing the surface, but it can also be the binding of a surface with organic material. And we see this especially on artificial surfaces, and you get a hard crust over the top and it stops the surface from draining properly. And that allows the surface to stay damp, and you get moss and other weeds caused by that. And then surface displacement, which is the movement of the surface, which creates pockets for soil to sit in. And this is often caused by both heavy traffic and also freeze thaw. I often get the comment, well, why can't we tolerate weeds on hard surfaces to an extent? And I think freeze thaw is the biggest argument against it. If you leave soil damp on a surface and you get a morning like this morning where it's gone to -5, you end up with the surface, the soil and the water it's holding freezing, and then expanding out any cracks in the surface and breaking it up and making those cracks bigger. So more water can get in the next time and soil can get in the next time and push it out further. So they're the main problems we need to address. So an integrated weed management regime for a surface requires a tailored plan for that surface. We need to clarify the specific performance properties you're after. What does the surface need to do? Identify potential threats to those properties. So what's going to cause it to stop fulfilling those things? And then put in place preventative maintenance measures that will keep the surface performing at its best. So if you think about a typical highway, it's made up of quite a few different elements that all require their own maintenance. So a highway stretches all the way from one boundary fence or maybe a hedgerow or the front of a house all the way to the same on the other side. And in between, you'll have often a section of hedgerow, a verge, the main carriageway, a footpath, and then the same vegetation the other side. And all of these elements and the design of them impact the weed growth you're going to get on the hard surface. The biggest win you can achieve when dealing with weeds is removing the soil from the hard surface. So the depth of the soil is extremely important because it's the depth of the soil that determines really what types of weed you're going to get there. If you have a perfectly clean tarmac surface, as Richard was saying earlier, the surfaces that are swept very often, like the city centres, you don't get weeds growing on those surfaces because there's no nutrients for them to use or support for them to use in the tarmac surface. But where soil builds up over the time from the buildup of detritus, you get deeper and deeper soil. And if that's left a couple of millimeters, you'll start getting moss. If it's left a little bit more than that, you'll start getting annual weeds that will send smaller roots out and they'll start growing up. Deeper again, you end up getting perennials, which have much deeper root systems. And obviously, but they require the depth to support them. And I have seen on certain pavements, woody shrubs and small trees growing out of the soil that enough's built up. And if you don't do enough sweeping, don't do enough removing the soil, that's what you'll end up with. So this soil then is being caused by detritus falling from trees, from the grass clippings that aren't collected, from the other plants and animals, even from dead weeds that we've sprayed and left on the surface. So the next biggest thing after removing the soil that's already there that you can do is preventing the soil from arriving in the first place, which can be done by minimizing the amount of detritus that's generated by these different sources. So removing detritus is actually accounted for in our law. So the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 imposes duties under Section 89 on certain landowners and occupiers to keep specified land clear of litter and refuse, and on local authorities and the Secretary of State to keep clean public highways for which they are responsible. The DEFRA Code of Practice on Litter and Refuse clarifies this as well and says that detritus on metalled highways must be removed as a requirement of this duty to keep highways clean. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a detritus grading scale that they've put together to show what's acceptable and what's not. And there's a time scale for how quickly each grade should be removed. It's expected that managers of land should, through monitoring, as we've discussed, an appropriate use of resources, keep land clear of litter and refuse so it doesn't fall below the grade B that was on the slide previously, and is cleansed to an A on a regular basis. Metalled highways must be free of detritus after cleansing to a grade A. Where vegetated and metalled surfaces abut, so along a rural road, for example, with a verge straight on the road, managers should make a judgment as to the definitive edge of the metalled surface, and the extent of the detritus should then be removed so it's back to the edge. And detritus can be managed with an effective sweeping regime. So on top of sweeping and getting rid of this, it's also important to think about having the right plant in the right place to begin with. So there's certain verges, for example, that might not need to be grass. Grass has been a well-adopted plant for verges, but it needs mowing maybe 8 or 12 times a year. And if you're dropping and leaving all that grass and it gets blown onto the surface, that's an awful lot of detritus buildup. The same with trees. You can choose certain different types of trees for different areas so that you're picking trees that aren't dropping so many leaves and cutting back canopies and things like that. So there's lots of different ground cover plants we could choose instead, and they may or may not be appropriate depending on where your verge is, how much foot traffic it's getting, etc. We can also design out the problem. So we can avoid areas in our design where soil might get trapped, that it's not so easy to sweep. So a sharp corner, your road sweeper finds very difficult to get into. So this picture is an example in York of where a sweeper obviously misses the corner to go around and continue, and misses on the other side, and then you get a massive buildup of soil and all the weeds. So if we design a sweeping bend to begin with, then it avoids this. And using barriers as well to prevent organic material from falling on the hard surface in the first place. The other thing that's crucially important to both the effectiveness of alternative methods. So a few of the alternative methods to using glyphosate are heat-based treatments, so thermal treatments. And the real key to using them effectively, cheaply, and efficiently is to catch the weed as early as possible. So the earlier we treat the plant in the cycle, the smaller it is, so the quicker you're able to pass over it with the heat, so it uses a lot less energy. The plant also has a lot less energy in itself as well to be able to regrow. So it will take far fewer applications if you can hit it early on in the cycle. And then we can also deplete the seed bank. So lots of people I talk to are treating weeds for the first time in the year during late May, early June, by which point the plant is so big it's going to seed or soon, and you spray the glyphosate, and then in a panic, I suppose, as much as plants panic, it will put all its energy into producing seeds to carry on, and then you've increased the seed bank. What we do if we treat it earlier, well before it starts going to seed, is that we stop it doing that, and you get far less seeds in the soil to begin with. So your annual preventative tasks then. In winter, this is the best time of year to be removing the soil and cutting back trees and removing foliage, etc., so that the opportunities for new weed growth in the coming season are absolutely minimized. You'll have clean pavements, etc., to begin with. Then in spring, early spring, so March really, but then onwards is the best time to administer thermal treatments to weeds. So there's several different options that all work very well depending on the surface. Again, hot water, and there's some hot water products on the market that don't require a diesel generator to be going while they're heated. So they're a bit more efficient inherently. There's also hot air. So that there's a few different hot air systems. There's foam. All these systems work by using thermal energy to wilt the plant. But they work much more effectively on smaller, younger plants. Then summer is the best time to ensure that any grass and leaf clippings are collected as you're going along. So every time you're cutting the grass, if you can put in a cut and collect system rather than cut and drop, you will really improve your situation. And then keeping on top of leaf fall and reducing detritus in autumn, it's a big task, but it really needs to be done to keep on top of that. And sealing any cracks in any hard surfaces. So in all your tarmac, you want any of the gaps up the edge of the curb, any of the cracks that have appeared to be sealed before the winter so that water can't get into them, freeze and make them bigger and make your job harder next time around. So now I guess it's up to you. My suggestion would be that each of you going forward doing an integrated weed management regime, conduct a survey of all your assets, have a look at all your roads, see what the current state of the surface is, what the weed problem is, what the soil buildup is, what the sources of detritus are, and see where you can minimize those sources of detritus, work to reduce it. Then remove all the existing soil buildup and then keep those surfaces free of detritus. So to do those things, it's mainly going to be weed brushes and sweeping. And perhaps a certain amount of doing it by hand, depending on budget. And then treating any weeds that do come through early to reduce the seed bank. If you want any more information on surface maintenance or weed prevention and integrated weed management, we've got quite a lot on the website. Please take a look at the links that are on the screen now. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I'll hand you back over.
Thank you very much, Sean. A fascinating presentation and great to have those thoughts. And the two presentations that, have aligned nicely, and there's lots of kind of common themes and threads and some really good questions that have come in as a result. So I think I'm going to head straight to the questions and ask you these. There's quite a few that are nicely linked, and I'll put to you and to you both. So I think, Richard, to pick up on the first question, really based on your presentation, Al's interested about the current local authority procurement model and if that is capable of selecting kind of contractors that are using IPM methods. In your experience, are local authorities using IPM as part of their criteria for selection of contractors?
Well, like I said, IPM, we're contractors. We will do what is asked of us. So we can recommend, we can suggest, but at the end of the day, the local authority has to decide what it wants to achieve, what its goal is, and it has to then specify that within its tenders. then it's open to contractors to come back and apply for those tenders and put prices in based on the specification. It's not really up to, unless you're going to consult with somebody and ask for their advice, we're not in that position to recommend and tell people what to do. The local authority has got an awful lot of resources at their disposal, and then they can put together their tender based on what they want to achieve. Now, if they want to achieve a reduction in the use of herbicides, then maintain your surfaces. That's the key. Make sure there's no environment for weeds to grow in to start with, and then there's no need to apply pesticides. You are sweeping every day, week after week after week. So why are there any weeds growing there anyway? There's no need to apply a pesticide in those areas. Think about it differently and engage with a contractor to achieve your goals. The problem is that most people just want to get their weeds dealt with, and they just want a tender signed, sealed, and that's it. And if the contractor doesn't meet the requirements of that tender, then there's penalties and all that sort of thing. And that's the way it is. But what you really want is engage with the contractor, decide what you want to achieve, and specify that within your tenders.
I think that's great. And I think, as an industry, there's an opportunity, isn't there, to kind of advocate that people are looking for these kind of approaches within their tenders as well. And I know that's kind of what the Amenity Forum and the Amenity Assured and Lawn Assured schemes are kind of, encouraging the industry to think about this and advocating for councils for that to play a role within their contracts. I don't know, Sean, whether you've got a feel on that as well,
Yeah, a little bit. So again, it depends on the council. We come across an awful lot of councils who will set up a trial, for example, but they'll set up a trial instead of, as Richard was explaining in the beginning, it's one alternative versus glyphosate. And it's probably done at a time of year where all the weeds are already large, there's all the soil in place, and so everything is working against the alternative. Rather than using it as a preventative tool, it's being used as purely a remedial tool, and so it has less effect, and it's in conditions that are perfect for only one solution to work, and that's glyphosate. Whereas if the council does a bit more thinking to begin with, and we've had several councils where we've had a lot of success at this, goes and does a survey of all the roads and assesses what the roads actually need. You can cut down on certain tasks and increase others, and actually the budgets can balance, and you can do it relatively cheaply. But it takes a bit of holistic thinking about, rather than just trying to swap one product for another.
Yeah. I think that's it, isn't it? Is thinking about it as a system rather than, purely.
Nobody's considering integrated pest management at the moment, really. I don't think anybody is seriously considering it. What they do want to do is find an alternative to glyphosate. And all of these alternative approaches have their place in an integrated system. But what they don't stand up very well to do is a replacement for glyphosate. You can't brush hundreds of thousands of miles of street. You can't wilt weeds. It's just boggling amounts of water and fuel that are required to wilt weeds year on year on year every day. It's crazy.
So kind of linked to that then, how Tim's asked a question which is kind of linked about how you document your choice of your appropriate method under the integrated weed management process. Is that something that you'd document either as you're kind of doing the operations, Richard, or as part of that contract process? Is there a way that you document that thought process that's got you to that solution, if you like?
Well, we've dealt with clients in the past, and they've consulted. You've had a consultation, and you document things by writing them down. And if you write down the outcome of your consultation and the decisions you've made based on those consultations, or just your ideas, your objectives, your goals, we're going to try and do this in this area, then you carry out the methodology that you have devised, and then if it works, it works. And the document is going to be the reduction in herbicide. If you can demonstrate that you're using less and less, because of your interventions, you're using less and less pesticide, then that's a great. If you can document that you're using less and less hydrocarbons, if you're using less and less fuel, less and less water, they're the outcomes that you can measure that show that the implementations that you're delivering are working. It's easy. You can measure it. You can count it on your fingers. It's simple.
Yeah. No, thank you. Shauna, do you have a process that you would advocate for people to think about how they manage things?
So what we've done with one or two councils, that typically the situation is they've decided to go glyphosate free a year or two ago. They've done nothing about it, or they've tried one thing and it hasn't worked, and they've come to us, and then we go through and do a survey with them road by road and assess what's the sources of detritus. Where can we remove some of those? Where can we, help improve biodiversity at the same time, by putting some different types of plant down that's more effective at suppressing weeds and also reduces the amount of detritus that's produced. And then, okay, how much soil buildup have we got? Where are the key areas that we really need to be hitting with a weed brush that would make the most impact? Let's go and do those first. And once those things are done, then it becomes a lot easier to create a schedule of, right, I'm going to go out and treat this road at this time. And I mean, there's been a few questions about how often does thermal treatment required? Well, it depends entirely on that assessment of that road, how many sources of detritus there are, what the soil buildup is. But if it's a clean road, I mean, I have a village in Scotland that I looked after the weed control along that particular road in front of the loch. And I went there once a year with a weed brush, and that was enough. You didn't need thermal treatment. In one or two places along the road, you could have spot treated some weeds with one thermal treatment, and that would have kept it completely weed free, more or less. But the soil is the biggest aspect. But in that area, there was only a few trees along the side of the road and a very small verge. So the build-up that was there originally was from years and years and years of neglect. And there was a lot of material there. Whereas once I'd taken all that away, the next time I came back, there was only an inch or so regrowth onto the pavement. So there's very little to deal with. So the first year of any implementation is going to be extremely hard work. But going beyond that, if you're putting in preventative measures rather than just a replacement product, it gets a lot easier.
No, thank you very much. And I think it's that kind of, and that's what IPM's about, is thinking about how you might control it before you've got the problem, to control, isn't it? And that kind of preventative approach in it. There's a question from Alice here about weed prevention on gravelled areas. I don't know, Sean, whether you've got any tips for that one particularly. I mean, we've been talking about hard surfaces.
Yeah, so there's a few different things that can be done. I suppose the ideal ways of doing it, you want to remove as little gravel as possible. There are, without doing too much of a product push, we sell gravel path renovators that you can attach to tractors or two-wheel machines. And there's also the thermal methods, so hot air particularly, because you're not getting the surface completely drenched. And often the gravel surfaces are in places like cemeteries and things where access with large machinery is quite difficult. So, backpack hot air systems, etc., that look a little bit like the spraying lances or that kind of size work quite effectively in that kind of area. But again, you need to kind of think about removing the soil in that area, removing the plant, the vegetation that's there. So the gravel path renovator has knives that cut underneath the plant and lift the plant to the surface with the soil, and then you can blow that off the surface onto the soft surface, and then keep on top of the rest with whatever treatment you'd like, whether that's herbicide or whether it's hot air or whatever.
There's plenty of active ingredients approved for gravel, residual products. So which don't contain glyphosate.
There you go. One of the two. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So there's some interesting kind of just thoughts in the chat about involving local authorities in this kind of conversation, and thank you for those that are engaging in that conversation. And it's something that we want to continue. We feel that this is the start of the process, and you know, yourselves are operating in this space and thinking about it all. So you know, it's something that we're developing and working closely with the Amenity Forum to have these kind of conversations, so that proactive approach can be done in conjunction with yourselves doing the operation. So I think we're getting to the end of time. There's some brilliant questions, and we'll take the questions. There are some specific ones in here for our speakers, so we'll make sure we follow up on those with you as well. But I'd wonder if Richard and Sean, you'd just leave us with your kind of top tip, if you like, for people to think about going forwards, about how they can use an integrated approach. I don't know, what's the one tip to take away and to work on as part of after today?
I'll go first. I think the main thing is to try and reduce the amount of pesticide you apply. Try to integrate alternative methods and techniques with an overall reduction in pesticide. That's got to be your goal. If you just want to get rid of pesticide, then you have got a very rocky road you're going to go down, because carbon neutral 2030 ain't going to be easy, and if you're using hot water or hot foam or similar sort of interventions to manage your weeds in general.
Thank you, Richard, and that echoes Jane's just put a comment in the chat, and I think that's the importance of having this conversation, of thinking about the solutions and thinking about those in the round, you know, so we've had that rounded conversation. No, thank you, Richard. Sean, your top tip.
I think one of the biggest things I haven't mentioned is appointing within the organisation that's looking after the managing the surfaces an IPM champion who can liaise between departments, making sure that the guys who are delivering the sweeping talk to the guys who are doing, you know, the weed killing, talking to the guys, talking to the community to make sure that residents of streets, etc., are all doing their part. Users of parks are all doing their part, and that communication is really key. So appointing a champion to go and promote that communication and make sure all departments are talking and have the resources available to work together is key to it working.
No, thank you. And actually that's something that's come up, and it's interesting, in some councils they've now got kind of climate change champions or environment leads and sustainability leads, and I wonder if that remit might be able to be expanded to this sector and think about that as well. So no, it's a great suggestion for us to advocate for as an industry, Sean, as well. Brilliant. So if we just have the last few slides just to round off a few more resources. Sean's mentioned a few, Richard's mentioned a few that are out there. But if we can just, I don't know, Jade. Perfect. So just to kind of finish off this morning as meeting. So just to kind of say, Sean's mentioned some guidance that's available, but the Amenity Forum have guidance themselves in terms of creating an integrated weed management plan for amenity spaces. And I know there's been some conversation in the chat about how broad the amenity sector is, and we've covered a relatively small part during this session today. So I'd advise, you take a look at the Amenity Forum's guidance. As basis, we're building up this, and it's great to see the feedback of how much you've enjoyed this session, and that's great for us to feedback, and we can definitely do more of that as we go forward. I think being part of the network, and it, again, great to see your feedback, because today was all about kind of having this discussion and conversation and thinking about the solutions and seeing other opportunities and best practice, and how people are taking the kind of the questions and being able to find the solutions. And I just wanted to kind of share with you, under the amenity standard that's run by the Amenity Forum, the schemes that are under that. So amenity assured, lawn assured, and invasive weed control. That's all about demonstrating externally about what we're doing and what we're doing to the highest professional standard. So Amenity Assured is for amenity contractors, and IPM and thinking about integrated weed management, as well as kind of training and records and how we apply the products, how we store it, is very much a part of that scheme. And so for those of you that are part of that scheme, I know you use that as part of the discussions with councils and tenders, and those of you that might be interested in doing it and thinking about it in this way and being able to demonstrate that you're taking that integrated weed management approach. And similarly with Lawn Assured, again, what can we do? How can we think about it? How can we demonstrate that approach and showcase that professional standard that we're doing externally? So if anybody would like more information on that, there's things that we can provide for you that are public facing as well as for you internal, to be able to say we're thinking about this and we're taking that forward as part of your tender process. There's also the training that sits behind it. I've showcased a couple of the nominated storekeeper training sessions here. We have a course on turf management as part of the BASIS classroom that's available, and we're looking at developing that offer as basis for the amenity sector as well. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you. Thank you to Richard. Thank you to Sean. There's been lots of thank yous come in through the chat, which is appreciated. You've given us a really interesting insight and perspective. There's lots of ideas in there. There's lots of questions that we can go away with and think about. Richard, yours about, is 95% weed control the right thing? Sean's, how can we think about that detritus and soil management as we go forward? The session has been recorded and it will be available through the BASIS classroom going forward, and we can share that with you through that format. If you haven't added your 200 number into the chat already, please drop me an email and we can do that. And just to say, to get in touch if you've got any questions about being part of the Assured schemes or got suggestions for future webinars along this, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I can work with Lindsay and Kim in our audit schemes team to take that forward. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your engagement and participation into the chat and to the questions. We'll come back to you, and thank you to Richard and to Sean for joining us. Have a great afternoon. Thanks very much.